The Holy Gospel is written in the 9th chapter of St. Mark, beginning at the 30th verse. Jesus and his disciples went on and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was there in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who is to be the greatest. He sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "Whoever wants to be the first must be the last of all and the servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Here is the gospel for the day. Please be seated. Ever notice that sometimes we have a gospel lesson and it just seems to be so insignificant, so trite, something that we've all experienced at one time or another and don't think anything of it. And then Jesus comes into the midst and he tells a story, frames a story, and he bases a philosophy of life on it. And all of a sudden he says it's not insignificant. This is very, very important. Suddenly we wake up to a new dimension in our life. And that's what our gospel is like this morning. Jesus just told them that he was going to Jerusalem. He would suffer. He would die. They didn't understand it. And it obviously didn't understand it because on the way home they were arguing about who was to be the greatest. And so Jesus, very casually, when he comes in to the meeting with the disciples, he said, "What were you talking about on the way here?" And there was dead silence. You know the kind of dead silence when somebody's talking about you and you walk into the room and all of a sudden nobody's talking anymore? And they'll say, "Oh, what were you talking about?" That's the kind of silence because they were embarrassed. Of course they were embarrassed. He was talking about dying, and they were talking about who was to be the greatest after that. And all of a sudden, this passage becomes very relevant. We put so much significance in being number one, don't we? Just so much. We idolize those that perform at a level that nobody else seems to be able to. Well, we've just gone through the Olympics. You ever think as you were watching the Olympics, and I know a lot of you did, you ever think about what it would be like to be the number one at something in the whole world? Being faster or stronger or more whatever, more than anybody else in the world, the world's best. And we show so much respect and adulation for them. And sometimes after something like that is over, they talk about going back to real life, about having a life again. Because all that they've done through the last 4 to 8 to 16 years was concentrate on one thing, and everything else had to become sort of secondary. There's a new hero in the sports world, a man by the name of Shohei Ohtani. He comes from Japan. He was hired by the Los Angeles ball club, and he's a designated hitter. Los Angeles Angels. And just this week, or I guess it's last week now, but he set a new standard, a new kind of record for the record books. He created the 50-50 club, the first person in history to steal 50 bases and hit 50 home runs in 1 year. Babe Ruth had a lot of home runs, but he didn't steal any bases. Jackie Robinson stole a lot of bases, he didn't hit many home runs. But Ohtani set a new record in achieving both at the same time. And it looks like he might be the 60-60 club. He's that far along already. And not only that, he can pitch really well, but he's got a sore arm right now, and he can't pitch. Man, not only to be first in the country now, but to be the first in the history and doing something that they're telling probably won't be duplicated in the history of the game. Wouldn't it be nice to be in that spot? Oh, I shouldn't forget. University of Texas is #1, right? I know some of you are waiting for that. I don't know how that, I'm a UT fan. I'm a Texas fan of anybody else that they play. And I don't know if they deserve that honor with playing 3 high school teams and 1 national contender. But we'll see. But they're #1. And so I like to call people in Minnesota and say, hey, see who's #1? See, and particularly with Minnesota, because they think education is what you go to college for. They never have any good team. But there's nothing wrong with achievement, is there? To be able to strive and be successful and do something better, there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes you get carried to the extreme. And let's talk about a couple of extremes. In the 1980s, there were 2 Russian ships that collided in the Black Sea. Well, there were 389 people killed. Another 960 that were thrown into the ocean that were or to the sea that were rescued. And the problem? The problem had nothing to do with any malfunction in the ship. None in the directional stuff that they had. There was nothing wrong with the climate. You could see perfectly well. What you had was 2 captains of 2 ships that knew they were heading for each other, and they were arguing about which one had to move. Because one had a little superiority in terms of his occupation, but the other one thought that he did because he went in a specific sea. And so they crashed and killed 389 people because neither one of them would move. Because each one of them wanted to be #1. Now the Russians had a solution to that. They sent them both to Siberia and they both died. They knew how to take care of people who looked out for #1 in terms of themselves and didn't look out for anybody else. In World War II, there were a lot of reasons for the Nazis' defeat, but one of them was air power. Now, the interesting thing is the Germans had the best plane, the Messerschmitt. They had the best plane, a fighter plane in the world, much better than the British Spitfire. It was one thing that they did in creating the Messerschmitt. They were told that they had to create the cockpit of the Messerschmitt to the terms of the ideal German. The physical ideal German. And who do you suppose was the physical ideal German? Adolf Hitler. He was 5 feet tall. And that's how they built the cockpits of the Messerschmitt. That didn't mean that they couldn't fight, it's just that they were handicapped, lost a lot of morale because of the difficulty of being able to maneuver in that cockpit. Because one person wanted to be number one, the ideal, the perfect. And that's what happens when we concentrate on just elevating ourselves. Sometimes we go to extreme means to inconvenience and sometimes hurt other people. We like to hear when somebody is called down from being so interested in being number one. A story that comes from Sweden. There was a British soldier that was traveling through, and he stopped at an inn. He was riding horses. He was looking for a relay team to continue on his journey. And he stopped at this inn, and there was only 2 that were available. And the person said, "It's not available, there's only 2, and that carriage over there, do you see it? They had that, they leased that." And he said, "Well, I'm a British general, and I am here on invitation, and I demand that you give me those 2 horses." And he said, "Well, you go over and talk to him yourself." We came in, and I came over to this man who was dressed kind of well, and looked sort of sophisticated. And he said, "I need your 2 horses." And he said, "Well, I'm just about ready to leave. I got to use them myself." And he said, "Do you know who I am?" And the fellow said, "I don't have the slightest idea who you are." And he said, "Well, I am General Shamangi. And I am the last one in my race." To which the person replied, "Well, I'm glad you told me that, because if your race was perpetuated, it'd be a very contentious society." He stunned, and he said, "Well, thank you for the conversation. I must go on." And he ran into the house, the general, into the inn, and he said, "I want that man arrested. Who is that man any? Who does he think he is?" And he said, "Well, he doesn't have to think anything about what he is. He's the king of Sweden." We like stories like that, where people think they're so important, and then they get brought down to a real world. Okay, now we talk kind of metaphorically, but now let's get down to the brass tacks. When does this become a sort of a problem? Well, it becomes a problem in families, in relationships. It becomes a problem in politics. And yes, it becomes a problem very often in the church. I want to be number one. Can be on a small plane or a large one. But it always seems to cause problems. And Jesus is saying, you got to take and understand what it means to be number one in the kingdom of God. And then he starts to tell them. And he tells them things they don't want to hear. He tells them some things that are preposterous. He talks about being last. He talks about being a servant of all. A whole new concept of what it is to be number one. And so while I would recommend all of you today to achieve as much as you can in your particular chosen field or hobby or whatever it is, don't let it consume you to the point where it becomes a stumbling block to other people. And that's all that Jesus was saying. Jesus said, try not to be number one. That's the first step. Because if that becomes your focus on just accomplishing one single thing, then you forget about a lot of other things that are important. It's one thing to get your ducks in order. I think that somehow the owner of Chick-fil-A has Jesus as a trainer. You ever gone to Chick-fil-A and been insulted by one of the clerks? They do little tasks for you. They make them go out of their way and they say, my pleasure. The other day, I just wanted to test it out. I got in a little conversation with that one who was clerk. And I got my meal and she didn't say, my pleasure. So I stood there. And she said, did I forget something? And I said, yes, you did. You forgot something really important. You forgot to thank me and say it was your pleasure to serve you. And she looked at me and she winked. And she said, you know, I was so interested in our sparkling conversation that I just forgot to say it was my pleasure. I think that we ought to hire whoever trains people at Chick-fil-A to train church members. Where it comes to the point when we dealt with each other and somebody said thank you, we could say, my pleasure. Where the emphasis is on serving. And that's the second thing. He said you need to be a servant. Because if you're so concentrated on yourself, you forget about people all around you. There's another metaphor that comes from Sweden. It's about a king that had a palace, and they're all around the walls of his room. He had mirrors so he could look at himself. He was just enamored at the reflection that he got back, that he was dressed properly, probably better than anybody else in the kingdom. And then one day when the king was gone, somebody replaced all the mirrors with windows. And the next day when the king went to see his reflection, he saw the outside. People that were poor, people that were starving, people that had difficulties, people that were sick. And it changed. Because when you stop looking at yourself, then you start looking at other people. One of the things I do about one of my sports heroes is Scotty Scheffler. Best in the world now, for about 40 weeks. But when Scotty gets done with the round, the one that's there to meet him after the initial 4 important people on the green, and the person that's running the tournament is his wife. And he holds her and kisses her. And now he takes the baby. And he took the baby along with him to the tent to register his final score. You know, that just seems to have priorities in order. So the text today isn't insignificant. It's a big deal. Jesus says, yes, it's okay to be number one, but to be number one in the kingdom of heaven is to make yourself less important. To understand that you're there to be a servant. And put your house, the house you live in, more enamored with windows than me.